This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Shadee Malaklou, who is chair of and teaches in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Berea College, where she is also the inaugural founder and director of the Bell Hooks Center. Her work focuses on variations of Afro-pessimism, from the expansiveness of its vision to important critical interventions against its nihilism. In this conversation, we discuss the cultural and political meaning of pessimism, the foundations of the field of Black studies in nihilism and resistance to it, and the transformative role of gender and sexuality studies for the field. Good afternoon, Professor. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
I'm super happy that we found time to get you on the podcast. We've been friends a while, and I really love your work. I think it's super adventurous and interesting. And among the many things also, it's just really great to have you on as the director of the Bell Hooks Center, because I think it's important to get your perspective and a sense of how your work and the kinds of things you think about are related to that, as well as your teaching and reading and so forth. So all that's just to say a long welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and thanks for your thoughtfulness. I appreciate it.
Thank you for that super generous welcome. I'm grateful to be on. I've admired your work, but specifically the way you operationalize your work in terms of conversations outside and a subterfuge of the academy.
Oh, I appreciate
that I really do respect. So I'm grateful to be in conversation now and always. Thank you, John.
So let me start with, we'll have a chance to talk about how you think about the field of Black studies, and of course also talking about how your work relates to it. Your work, both as a scholar and teacher, but also as a center director. So you have, I think, a really rich story to tell in terms of that. But I wanted to start really with a more personal question, which is just to ask you, what drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to interest in Black studies? And always for me, what sustains you in relation to this kind of work?
Thanks for that question. I think about this often, especially because I know I'm a guest in someone else's house doing this work. And I think what it comes down to is that Black studies help me understand processes of dehumanization, and the ways in which my own pain might make sense. I really do resonate with Bell Hooks's auto-theoretical observation also on my email signature that she says, I came to theory because I was hurting. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend what was happening around and within me. And most importantly, I wanted to make the pain go away. I found this too, when I read Fanon, especially in graduate school. I think Fanon was like a biblical experience for me, Black Still White Mask. And then when I read observations like David Marriott's, what do you do with a subconscious that hates you? That really touched something in me, crystallized, I think, and gave a language to lived experiences that I had, not just of dehumanization, but of the ways in which, and I later articulate this as my own theoretical invention, the ways in which sex and gender for me have always been signposts or technologies of race as a species, differential or historical cut, right? We might think of it as a hieroglyphics, following Spillers. That's articulated, Fanon says, as racial historical schema. Marquise Bey, in his new Black Transfeminism, summarizes this as, quote, the cartological maps that have been imposed not simply on, but as our bodies. And which we could say sediment us in, quote, territorializing projects or historical arrival. I think I remember I have a philosophy section of my website in which I try to explain this, again, knowing that I'm a guest in someone else's house. And there's an ethical quandary to that. I grew up in a very suburban white neighborhood where the best schools were, but which was very much a Reagan country articulation of white liberal respectability. And my mom and dad separated when I was very young. And by the time I was in school, my maternal grandmother had arrived to the U.S. to take care of me while my mother worked several jobs. And my grandmother, Momonjun, could only speak 2 sentences in English. One was "nobody home, call back," because this was pre-call waiting, and even so, we couldn't have afforded it. And the other was "I love you." And I just remember her hijab and walking with her to school and noticing the white gaze of my peers and their parents as they wrote her and me by relation into being not as agents of history, but as artifacts. And I think I felt even then that I was a problem for time. And I have this really jarring memory, this formative memory, when in kindergarten, I had a neighbor who I thought was my closest friend, but I guess I didn't put 2 and 2 together when she would give me crucifix-themed things for every holiday or birthday. But we were sitting, and I also remember I had to leave her house before the other kids when there were get-togethers. But I didn't put 2 and 2 together. But one day, in recess or lunch or what have you, she gave me an ultimatum. And, with the mean girls she had assembled, she said that she would only have to extend her friendship, and they would extend their friendship, if I stopped speaking that language, if I disassociate from my grandmother, if I start bringing normal foods to school, if I dye my hair blonde. They had this litany, and I remember being so desperate, and I don't even think it was for the friendship, but for the whiteness, that I said yes, and I held myself to it. My grandmother has been the only source of unconditional love I've ever known. And I betrayed it to the point where for 2 days and nights, I really did not acknowledge her. And not when she fed me, bathed me, loved me, hugged me. I did not acknowledge her. And I think I've always been so desperate to understand that betrayal and to really, I don't want to say make it right, but to have a language to wholesale reject the promise of inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, being a dark kid in the neighborhood, I about in the 4th grade, a Black family moved in, and I all of a sudden wasn't such an ontological threat. And I remember in college, I learned from Black women I attended a leadership conference, a women of color leadership conference with. I remember they looked at me and they said, "What are you doing here? You're not a woman of color." And I think I realized that I have, and Afro-pessimism also helped me put language to this, I have passing privilege in ways in which sometimes I am the container of ontological anxiety, and sometimes when I'm not the darkest person in the room or the most racially threatening, I become a safer person of color. And so I guess this is what leads me to this is what the personal that leads me to the political of the work that I do. And so my investment in Black studies was kind of accidental. I worked after my undergraduate degree at Duke in cultural anthropology and what is now gender, feminist, and sexuality studies. I went to DC and I hopped from job to job trying to find my niche. I led State Department funded youth programs. I was a communications director. I opened an NGO. And what I realized soon enough was that my problem, my questions were not with politics, but with power. And in DC, many of the people wanted to climb the ladder of power and ascend into power and not actually critique or do away with structures of power. So I applied for graduate school, but of course, I think that my education at Duke led me to believe that cultural anthropology is a little more theoretical than it is. So I applied to all anthropology programs and on a lark, culture and theory at Irvine. Well, the recession hit and few programs were accepting, and I got into culture and theory from the wait list, and I got in nowhere else. And luckily, I got in. And in my first year, the core series was offered by Jared Sexton and I believe Frank Wilderson soon thereafter. And it was right after Obama had won the presidency. And I remember not getting it at first. And actually, I have a lot of shame about being in the classroom with Jared in those first few weeks and saying, I don't understand we have a Black president. I don't think I understood the meta-critique of human rights qua ontological resistance in relation to civil rights or to structure. And so I fell into it accidentally, and it gave me the language I think I was always seeking, specifically in its reading of Fanon, and in the ways in which it provides a way to, an ethics to politicize that turn away that I couldn't do as a child.
Mm-hmm.
A wholesale turning away from the politics of recognition that goaded me to betray my grandmother, and therefore the only source of unconditional love I think I've ever received. And now we're back to feminism, to Belle, right? It's all about love. Lama Rod Owens visited Berea College last month in conversation with me about Belle's work, and he very brilliantly remarked that when Belle says, that we engage rage, it's really about heartbreak. And so I really did come to theory because I was hurting, and I'm still here.
That's I mean, I say this almost every episode after people respond to this opening question. I love hearing the responses to these questions because it's a reminder of, for me, not only, that Black studies is an interesting field or an important field and, for all these sort of political, cultural, and social reasons, but also just that existential significance of what Black studies has to offer for our understanding of our own lives in such manifold ways. People come to the insights of Black studies, and it, as humans, and and that the story about the Mean Girl group is almost like a Lifetime movie network version of the opening of Souls of Black Folk. I mean, it's so over the top, but also makes complete sense. I mean, if you understand the function of anti-Blackness, right?
Yeah.
And the function of whiteness, it absolutely is this. I mean, it's so bold and over the top, but this is part of what children reveal, right? Because they don't know.
It wasn't just her; it was other children on the playground of a less threatening racial difference than me, who would call me it and monkey, to the point where I wasn't hailed. I didn't respond the first time on the playground that someone used she, her pronouns to describe me. And so like this critique of humanism, so resonates, and it is the meta critique. What is it? Sexton says that racial Blackness, right? And as the critique of the critique, he says, quote, teaches us all how we might better inhabit multiplicity under general conditions at the global scale. I would like to see Black studies thought of more capaciously as not just what shows us the limitations of our current epistemological approaches, but that which is recognized as the portal into another sociality, into the elsewhere and elsewhen, right? That Fred Moten says, might be that thing we're grasping for. I love Fanon's reading of Marx's 18th Premier in the final chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. I must not look to history for the meaning of my destiny. I must remember that the real leap, right, involves introducing invention into existence.
Well, not to self-advertise, but I will send you a copy of my book on nihilism when it comes out in the fall. It's exactly about these moments of breakage. But
Please do.
But let me pick up. I gotta get better at self-promotion. I think I just did it. So there we go. So you say sort of how you would like Black studies to be seen. And so let me actually use that as a way of transition to this next question and ask you about the portrait of Black studies that you work with, how you imagine the field. And I'm specifically interested in how you think about the field in relationship to its origin story, which was conflicted at some level, or at least in tension. One which was students, some faculty, but really students mobilizing to say there's no place to study Black life in the disciplines. Black studies is then founded through often very militant student demands, to study Black life. And that gives birth to Black studies, real transformation of our sense of the Black intellectual tradition. But also, of course, it's the late 1960s and early 1970s. This is the moment of the radicalization of Black liberation struggle, which had really questioned the boundaries between campuses and communities, between study and prescriptive action, between activism and the book. And so, that also gave birth to this part of Black studies that has been about a commitment to a certain political agenda, right? And so there's a sort of intellectualism and activism, just to use a kind of simple binary there, as part of the founding of the field, that they're both at the origin point of the field. Now, that's 50-something years ago, but I think these questions still stay with us when we think about Black studies and what it is and what it ought to be. So I want to ask you how you imagine the field of Black studies, your portrait of the field of Black studies, in particular in relationship to this origin story.
It's a really good question, and I think a one that cuts to through the longue durée that I think is currently a problem-oriented approach and looks backwards. I kind of like how you start at the beginning and move forwards. Mm-hmm. I think that Afro-pessimism is also politically active, at least it was at Irvine. I admittedly don't have a lot of experience in Black studies outside that tradition. So I've always known it to be a politically vigilant approach. However, I also don't think the political demands of Black studies in its current... I do think that Afro-pessimism is kind of the darling of Black studies right now. I will say that. So in its current Afro-pessimist moment, I don't think the demands can be rectified in the current world order. Frank said consistently that what we need is an epistemological catastrophe. That's what will undo the world, or, redo how we know what we know and not just what we know. I don't know when the zombies are coming. I don't know when the apocalypse is here. I don't know when climate change will create an opportunity for another beginning. I don't even know. My students often ask me, okay, the leap, what does that look like? And I don't really have an answer for them. And that's where I feel like I show up with empty hands.
That's what futurity means. I mean, it does mean the unprecedented. Yeah.
Well, right. And all I can do is, give them examples like Sun Ra and Alter Destinies, or we oftentimes actually think with Jared's notion in the Social Life of Social Death essay. He says, dance to the madness, for there is freedom there. And he's referencing Topsy of the Colored Museum. There's freedom there in the unending, uninterrupted captivity, a mad freedom where there is none. And we watch Jay-Z's 444 and of the Brooklyn-based dancer that just turns and turns. And what does it mean to make something from nothing? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to not be able to how can you skip coordinates along man's longue durée, right, without ascending them? How do you twirl through time? My research, as you know, is very invested in the politics of time. I think of social and political constructions of time that goad us towards positivism and progress that can only ever recreate the current and the beyond, as Zakiya Maud Jackson would say. I think that too is political. And I will say that I think the merging of a gender studies approach to Black studies, which, Frank has said Afro-pessimism is informed by Black feminism a la Saidiya Hartman and Hortense Spillers. But I think it dates further back to Ida B. Wells, right? And to James Baldwin, who also really think through, they really think through. Frank says that anti-Blackness is not just a form of discrimination, but a form of psychic health for the rest of the world. They think through that racial sexual terror, right? Afro-pessimism is not the first to do that. But I always think it's through a gendered approach. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I can answer your question. I don't think I really have, and I apologize for that. But if Black feminism is leading alongside a Black studies approach, then what we really need to think about is the personal as political.
Mm.
I think maybe getting our house in order is what we can do in the meantime as we wait for the epistemological catastrophe. And I think we should remember, if we want to think about it in a metacritical way, I really do enjoy the way Lewis Gordon thinks in Effeminacy. It's a chapter from Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, that from a psychoanalytic perspective, Blackness is femme. It's hyperpenetrable, right? All Blackness is that 0 degree of social conceptualization, as Hortense Spillers describes it. And so maybe by addressing the femme, you address, or by addressing the problem of Blackness, you address gender trouble, quite literally.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, that's perfectly a response to the question. I mean, in some ways, it's also a response to the next question I had for you. So, if you want to say what I just said, or maybe embellish a little bit, which is asking about your own work in relation to Black studies, which you've outlined, I think, really nicely there, especially around the relationship between politics and epistemology, which I think is a super complex, but I agree with you, an absolutely decisive horizon of Black studies. But your work is, as you said, gender studies, Black studies, resources, critical theory, and so I'm interested in how you think about your own research into the history of the field of Black studies. Where does it fit? But also, what boundaries does it push? Where does it not fit? What is it trying to make people think about that the tradition hasn't been able to contain or hasn't been able to address?
Yeah, thank you. My research wants to think through the container of the human, right, mapped by space and time, or the historical racial schema Fanon addresses. And I want to think about how, what holds up that structure. I do think Blackness is the 0 degree. It makes sense when Fanon says, it's no use, I arrived at the table of human civilization too soon and too late, right? At the start of man, right? Man born in an African no place, and then having not arrived, right? And interestingly, Appalachians here in Kentucky understand that critique. The curriculum I created here is now the top humanities major at Berea, and there was so much pushback by faculty who worried that the Appalachians wouldn't relate to a critique of white supremacist humanism. And actually what's happened is that through a theory of time, they understand perfectly what it means to not be able to ascend this ladder.
Interesting.
This is one of the crazy things that keeps me here. But in any case, and that curriculum, actually, more faculty voted against it than voted against the college putting out a letter acknowledging genocide in Palestine. So there was a lot of controversy around that.
Interesting.
But
I'm not surprised at all. I'm surprised that it's surprising, but that's where we're different.
It's frustrating. But in any case, the container of space and time, positions Blackness as the 0 degree. It holds up the edifice. And I do believe that arrival, like teleological arrival, puts us at racial whiteness, which is also the alibi for ability and cisness and or wholeness, right? And so as other people, non-Black people who are model minorities, or people whose nations are doing well financially, technologically, who are also have claim to modernity, as they climb that ladder, they can only ever be where Western Europe and its, junior partners have been all along. Mm-hmm. Right? And they only push the teleological, point of arrival further up. What's interesting is that those of us within the graph, right, ebb and flow, right? In Obama's America, I have more privilege, whereas in Trump's America, there's a Muslim ban, mm-hmm. right? But there is uninterrupted captivity for the racially Black person, right? Time does not move. But in being exterior to the container of the human, that's a portal, right? It becomes a condition of possibility for what we do not know and cannot claim, but dream and grasp for anyway, right? That's that elsewhere and else when that Blackness is the pivot to, but also is the reason Blackness is so exploited, etc., right? Mm-hmm. So that's my theory. I mean, the other thing that I add is, as you ascend that ladder of civilization, you can think of it like what you see in terms of evolution in a biology textbook. Or I was listening to some music the other day, and Willow, I guess, is a band, and they had a song, Wait a Minute, and this image appeared, again, of evolution, of man slowly standing upward. And of course, Fanon says the white gaze writes him into being as the missing link, right? And so that moment of arrival into human comportment, corporeal schema, becomes increasingly in the world we live in, maybe a non-binary body, but it's always white. That's the distinction. The difference is, as you move into that human personhood, all of a sudden, gender, sexuality become identity and type. It's no longer what feels good. It's who are you, right? And that's the violence of categorization. Sylvia Wynter says the genre of man creates all the isms. And so that's what's interesting for me. And I do think about it through a theory of time. And I think the approach has helped students make sense of a very dense theory. I teach them Afro-pessimist critiques.
Yeah.
In fact, the whole curriculum is an Afro-pessimist curriculum.
I like you sneaking that in through the, whatever percentage vote it was needed.
But I have to say it's also, and it wouldn't be a true engagement if it didn't also critique Afro-pessimism. And I do this. My scholarship is kind of schizophrenic. I both adhere and work through its thinking and also have critiques of it. So like one thing that really concerns me is who pays the price for its critique.
So what's interesting about you talking about, in multiple different ways about this question of time that preoccupies your thinking, your teaching, and really your organization of a curriculum, which I find that collaboration of all these ways you can talk about time or ways that can resonate, right, across curriculum, thinking, writing, organization. I actually think it's such an interesting case for the relevance of critical theory for Black studies, which I think is still such a marginal part of this field. I think that being a theorist is, there are theorists like Wilderson or Moten, who are prominent, right, figures, but really so much of the foundation of Black studies is historical and literary research, which is fantastic. I love that research. This is not a competition. But one of the things that theory does is allow us, as you were, I think, articulating so well, to not only think about something like time, but think about how time, as it's conceived in this case in an Afro-pessimist context, also allows us to uncover these new insights into historical texts. That how is Ida B. Wells thinking about time while not talking about time? How is, David Walker, how is Washington, how is Du Bois, I think there's such an interesting way of going back through the history of Black studies from the kinds of critical frames that you just articulated and the way it organizes other dimensions of canonical thinkers and makes them fresh, right? There's fresh insights to be gotten from that. And I think you really laid that out well. And and that comes obviously, very important ways from your training in the Culture and Theory program at UC Irvine. And so, just to make a transition to this next question, I'm interested to hear you talk about how, that's a multidisciplinary, if we can just not be complicated about the word, but it's a multidisciplinary, non-disciplinary field to get a PhD.
It's problem-oriented. It's problem-oriented rather than discipline-oriented.
And it's not it's not a discipline. And now you work, of course, in a gender and sexuality studies department, but also direct the Bell Hooks Center. And so, your intellectual life has not spent time in a discipline, and that's really interesting to me. And I'm interested to hear then you talk a little bit about how you think that non-disciplinary journey has shaped how you think about yourself as a writer and thinker, but also how it shapes your approach to a classroom.
Thank you. I think what situates me is that throughout graduate school, as after my first year, I was teaching. And I was specifically teaching in the women's and gender and sexuality studies classroom. I was either a TA or later I was an instructor of record for summer classes. And much later after my exams, I was teaching in the humanities core course, teaching writing. But really, as I was learning the critique, I was having to translate it in the classroom in ways that were attentive to gender. So in order to make it relatable and meaningful for students, I did make it, personal. I did apply it to the real world, and I really, tried to hone in, I guess on what's being described as like a libidinal economy of anti-Blackness, right? Something that resembles but also exceeds this idea of a structure of feeling that Raymond William comes up with. I really think of it in sociogenic terms. I want students to understand how the political economy imprints onto and maps their nervous system, the way they see the world. Sylvia Wynter, I think in an interview with Catherine McKittrick, describes this really well. She says basically that sociocultural, for lack of a different word, fuckery. I'm gonna read the quote. She says, quote, "Law likely functions to semantically, neurochemically induce the performative enactment of our ensemble of always already role-allocated individual and collective behaviors." Right. And even neuroscientists say that the first few years of life, the environment maps onto the brain. Mm-hmm. This isn't an entirely, this isn't an incredibly controversial claim, I don't think.
Yeah.
But basically,
it's only controversial when somebody puts it in difficult theoretical language, but the actual insight is like goes back to, in some ways, back to B.F. Skinner. So anyway,
right,
sorry.
And so no, you're absolutely right, and I think this gives us a language for like how the world maps onto and informs the dramas of our psychic interior lives, right?
Yeah.
And the way we dispense our energies or whatnot. But it wasn't until I was with Belle in the informal quarters of her home, where gossip was her theory, that I really learned how to take it out of that language that you're talking about, like out of that jargon.
Mm-hmm.
And it really wasn't until she died and I made sense. And writing has always been, I don't want to call it a talking cure, but I come to writing like I come to theory because I am hurting, because I am heartbroken, because I have rage. And Belle, comically enough, Belle always called me strident. She's like, "You're so strident." And it's so funny because anyone who knows her knows that was also a character, not flaw, but I would say a character perk of hers. Yeah, I came angry. I love this meet cute of Bell Hooks and her spiritual advisor, Thich Nhat Hanh. She says to him, or she says in an interview, that she came to him wanting to be loving and kind, and she came out of an abusive relationship, and all she had was rage and anger. And he told her, "That's okay, hold on to your anger and use it as compost for your garden." And I don't know, I had a lot of rage, and Afro-pessimism gave me a language for it. Black studies, as I learned it, gave me a language for it. And then I was able to integrate it with through gender studies, really. Mm-hmm. And honestly, making the personal political in ways that help me understand my own relationship to gender as a product of race. I have to say that I'm a bit of a narcissist in the sense that I'm trying to understand the way the world works and my place in it. I'm trying to give my students that language as well. I don't want them to have answers. I want them to remain in a question space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This is how my teaching and my writing have always operated. And I really, an ex-partner once told me, "I knew this is how you were in your work, but this is just how you are." I was like, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. That's a good thing.
I don't know what to say. I think at a time when gender studies wants to do the move of liberal pluralism and mix, add color and mix, what Jennifer Nash calls diversity work, Black Studies keeps it honest. And I think it's that history of coming from the students, coming from a movement, later being institutionalized. Gender studies has a similar history, but not quite as, I would say, militant. And whether it's militant because people see Black faces and assume militancy, or whether it was militant, that's a lot of it, or whether it was militant because its demands were unyielding. I don't know how to think these two unrelatedly.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't. And so I'm trying to think, as you're talking about the history of Black studies, I'm like, okay, who are my indexes, right?
Yeah.
They're all people who do Black feminism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't even have anyone in my Rolodex of my mind, and perhaps I'm the wrong person for this podcast.
No, the podcast is cast wide for this exact reason. What are the indices? What are the things that anchor a portrait and anchor demands on the field, right? And demands on your own thinking, but also, as you're talking and I listen to this now, people listen to this, provokes challenges as well,
Mm-hmm.
And how to think about the field of Black studies. And, that's, in some ways you've sort of walked right up to this next question, sort of penultimate question, which is, what do you think that the history of Black studies, I mean, I have some guesses where you're going to go with this, but what do you think Black studies has done well historically, but also what do you think it has not done particularly well?
I really appreciate that it poses the question of ontology or being, the meaning of being. Again, like the critique of the critique is I remember how Jared would describe it. And I appreciate that it's responsive or gives us, again, a language to understand what's happening in real time, to make sense of that longue durée preceding a BLM moment in which Black lives continue not to matter, right? But again, why we as individuals seem not to get enough of the dash cam videos, like chomping at the bit, like how many times until we believe? It's not that we don't believe. I mean, I'm of the thought sociogenically that if intergenerational trauma is a thing, then so is intergenerational bloodlust. And you look at some of those, and I don't want to encourage anyone to look at them, but there's images from lynchings in places like Fort Lauderdale. I know there's one specifically from 1935. It's the lynching of Reuben Stacy. And you see these white children, specifically the white girl of, the Queen of America goes to Washington City type. And she's just grinning ear to ear as this Black man is dying. And then, of course, body parts are taken for souvenirs. And I don't know how much of this is true, but, there's always that. I've heard that, picnic stands for pick an N-word. These were family affairs as far as, we can see even just from the psychic, social, the gaze in these scenes. And that's what I'm interested in helping students addressing. Like, why is it not enough?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Black studies, I think, does that particularly well. And I think, again, maybe it's because I've learned Black studies from a problem-oriented approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think what is more difficult is making sure that Black studies is not colonized by other kind of identity critiques while still being something that leads the motor of those kinds of queries.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, how do you, be that thing that calls everything into question and at the same time not be colonized and this not be another opportunity to appropriate and replace?
Yeah.
And by appropriate and replace, I mean, like, when you Google search Harlem Shake, it's a bunch of white boys in superhero costumes, right? Like that kind of replace, like literally replace from the record. I also think what is important is I recently was talking to a colleague, and I really do enjoy thinking with and teaching critical fabulation, but my colleague is a historian, and she helped me understand how that there are records, and it's important for those records to be thought about and honored and engaged. And so I am trying to to think with that as well. And finally, because I came to theory because I was hurting and I'm kind of a rage-driven thinker, that's where the polemicism of Afro-pessimism, I think, appeals to me. I want to think more with the joy. I think we need to recenter that part of Black study, the joy.
I love that. That's super interesting. Thank you. And I think there's a ton of insight to be gotten from that. With the questions of I think if nothing else, if this podcast gets people to start thinking about the inheritance of bloodlust, right? Because I think that's,
it's our visceral guts and instincts. There's no pure space of critique where we can be like, where's your humanity? But
and also, I mean, it's it's part of, and not to turn it back to my own interest in research, but this interesting way that in a broader sort of global context, the way decolonization has always been cast as a problem for the colonized, but never for the colonizer, as if the colonizer didn't live from this same machine. And and so thinking about not only what does it mean for Black people to think about the value of their own lives after 500 years of anti-Blackness. What does it mean for white people to think about their lives after 500 years of anti-Blackness in which they were entwined and inextricably entangled? And you see that in inheritances of bloodlust, which can be, I think, very uncomfortable for people who want to, white people who might want to think of themselves otherwise. But if nothing...
To stay with that trouble.
Yeah,
exactly.
Stay
with the trouble.
That's what I was going to say.
I'm seeing so many white people who want to think with... I'm seeing a lot of white scholars and white kind of liberals more generally do this weird, and it's a lot of white men, do this weird like Me Too turn. Whether it's claiming an ancestry, in some location outside of, Western Europe or America, or whether it's claiming a disability very publicly, the kind of woke move. I almost feel like claiming oneself as marginalized is a virtue signal that people use to get out of the responsibility and the trouble of the bloodlust, the accountability of the bloodlust. I really appreciate, actually, tangentially speaking, this might get me in trouble, but, when Kim Tallbear came out against, she was concerned when people stopped thinking with blood quantum that would open the door for a flood of people to claim indigeneity. And that's exactly what happened, right? So we're seeing a huge, of course, the pretendian turn. I think it's interesting that in a post kind of BLM, look at what you're doing, here are the videos moment, right? We're turning towards me. I'm marginalized too. And I'm like, where is there the space for the trouble? And maybe that's why Afro-pessimism appealed to me. Where is the space for the trouble?
Yeah. I mean, I think about a lot of things with that. I mean, it's the function of guilt. Guilt does weird things to people, and Nietzsche was right when he said that guilt and resentment are brothers. But also I think about what Stokely Carmichael said, asking about white people, and he said, "Is there a shame that leads to their revolutionary consciousness?"
Yes.
And I think that sense of being ashamed that makes you a revolutionary rather than the guilt that makes you resent being associated is one of these decisive crossroads. Well, let me transition then to a last question and ask you, in a Black Studies frame, the way you've talked about it, the way you imagine and conceive it, in a Black Studies frame, what is the issue you would want us all to be thinking about, or what's the question you would want us to all be asking?
Well, I do have a question, and perhaps this is the product of my kind of wearing a partially institutional hat as a center director. But I wonder, and it really is a provocation, again, a question space. I wonder about DEI, and why are we trying to hold on so hard to DEI And what would a critical opening actually create the possibility for, right? DEI has been diversity work, right, for the most part. And it's operated, I think, under a false liberal promise of inclusivity. It doesn't work for the people. It works for the corporate university. It's testifying to a pluralism and elasticity that expands to contract at the limit of racial blackness, which it imagines as absolute otherness, right? Until that epistemological catastrophe comes. And I do think that DEI is that same level of multiculturalism that Afro-pessimism emerged in a militant way, to critique, and has said, that this multiculturalism has goaded us to forget what inclusion into liberal society, which is human society, which is white society demands of us. A pound of our own flesh, right? Of course, we have to forsake those parts of ourselves that are race, sex, gendered, disabled, and otherwise different. It doesn't want us to love ourselves, right, as Bell wants us to. It wants us to love assimilation. It wants what I did with my neighbor Megan. It wants me to assent, right, and to assimilate into the bounds of whiteness. And this always contracts to exclude us anyway. It condones the structural violence, right, that turns Black bodies primarily, but sometimes otherwise race bodies into flesh for the mattering of white lives first, last, and only. And perhaps this is where I and Afro-pessimism disagree, because I also want to look at the pole of whiteness that tethers Blackness. As Hegel says, the human is what the human is not, and the human is not the Black African, right? I also don't think this idea of absolute dereliction happened in the hold of the ship. I think it happened in the heart of darkness, right? In an African no place. And it's much, philosophically, much deeper. But to return to the question, I apologize that I am such a circuitous thinker. My ADHD.
That's why this is a conversation, not an interview. So, yes.
But to get back to the problem of DEI, I'm wondering if rather than mourn its loss, right, if we can use its opportunity to creatively, innovatively rethink the role of education altogether. I'm disturbed by the fact that the liberal arts, if you look at the documentation of what liberal arts is, there's some guy, I think William Cronin maybe, that talked about the function. It's all about creating human capacity. And of course, liberalism is inviting all people to the table, right? Regardless, to provide a smorgasbord, right? Of different ideas from all liberal, ethical, and moral directions. But what would it mean, better yet, what would it feel like to offer education instead as Paulo Freire and bell hooks want to, which is as the practice of freedom, right? Where students can come to inhabit what Fred Moten, right, and Stefano Harley have described as the undercommons, or, this site of unsanctioned knowledge production. And I don't want to teach students how to navigate and rehabilitate this world, right? I do want them to imagine other conditions of possibility. But again, I only have questions, no answers.
Yes. Well, thank you. I mean, I might suggest this as a way of, as a moment of conclusion, because that's a really challenging and really, really urgent question. So I thank you for that. I might also ask if Black Studies departments aren't largely the undercommons of the university. I think that
they definitely are.
In terms of funding, location, enrollments, pay, everything, but also the way we just the history of Black Studies is a lesson in what it means to live without inclusion. And I think
so. What if Black Studies departments become the site of DEI funding and DEI resources in a kind of subtle way through the university? What if not in a way that adds kind of do more with less, but here's more for you to lead the way. Again, I don't know if this is possible. Perhaps
they ain't never letting us lead the way. They just get us a couple more faculty members.
Unfortunately, this is true. But this leads, of course, to the question of coalition. Yeah. What does it mean for other departments and other kinds of thinkers to consent and defer to Black Studies, right? If it is that which will show us how to better inhabit multiplicity under general conditions at the global scale, is that just lip service, or are we going to take direction?
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to conclude. That's a question not only for the Black Studies podcast, but for education, K through graduate school. So I appreciate that. This has been incredibly thoughtful and super rich and interesting. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I was looking forward to this, and it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. So thanks for your contribution to the series. Thanks for taking the time and being so thoughtful in this conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you for including my random musings. It's been a lovely conversation, and I'm sorry it's been so circuitous, but my brain doesn't think teleologically like my theory.
I think everybody loves circuitous. So thank you so much for that. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.